16-year-old millionaire humiliates and robs elderly cleaner, but when she reveals her true identity, everyone is shocked. Hello, welcome, leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. In the glittering world of Silicon Valley, a teenage tech prodigy's life takes an unexpected turn when a seemingly ordinary cleaning lady enters his world. Little does he know that this encounter will unravel secrets from his past and challenge everything he thought he knew about success, family, and the true meaning of wealth. The sleek, modernist mansion perched atop the San Francisco hills buzzed with activity as the staff prepared for yet another lavish party. At the center of it all stood Ethan Reeves, the 16-year-old tech wunderkind whose revolutionary app had catapulted him into the echelons of Silicon Valley royalty. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room with a mixture of boredom and disdain, a far cry from the wide-eyed enthusiasm that had characterized his meteoric rise just 2 years prior. "Jenkins," Ethan barked, his voice cracking slightly, a reminder of his youth despite his imposing presence. "Where's my limited edition Rolex? I told you I wanted it for tonight's gala." The harried personal assistant materialized at his side, tablet in hand. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Reeves, still at the jeweler's for cleaning, but I've arranged for a car to pick it up within the hour." Ethan rolled his eyes dramatically. "Unbelievable. Do I have to do everything myself around here?" He stormed off towards his private wing, leaving Jenkins to scramble in his wake. As he rounded the corner, Ethan collided with a small, wizened figure. The sound of shattering glass filled the air as a vase tumbled from the elderly woman's hands. Water and flowers spilled across the imported marble floor. "Watch where you're going," Ethan snapped, barely glancing at the woman as he sidestepped the mess. "I'm so sorry, young man," the cleaner said, her voice soft but steady. She knelt slowly, her joints creaking as she began to gather the broken pieces. Something about her tone made Ethan pause. He turned, really looking at her for the first time. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with a crown of silver hair and deep-set brown eyes that seemed strangely familiar. Her uniform was crisp and clean, but her hands were gnarled with age and years of hard work. For a fleeting moment, a memory tickled the back of Ethan's mind, the scent of freshly baked cookies, a warm laugh, a gentle hand stroking his hair. But as quickly as it came, the feeling vanished, replaced by his usual impatience. "Just clean it up," he muttered, turning away. "And be quick about it. I don't want any of my guests seeing this mess." As he walked away, Ethan missed the way the old woman's eyes followed him, filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. Later that evening, as the party was in full swing, Ethan held court in the grand living room. A group of Silicon Valley elites hung on his every word as he regaled them with tales of his latest acquisitions and upcoming projects. "And then," he said with a smirk, "I told the board that if they didn't like my vision, they could take their outdated ideas and—" A sudden commotion by the bar interrupted his story. Ethan looked over to see the elderly cleaner from earlier, now dressed in a server's uniform, struggling with a heavy tray of champagne flutes. As if in slow motion, he watched her stumble, the tray tipping precariously. In that moment, Ethan had a choice. He could step forward, help steady the tray, prevent a disaster. But something held him back, pride, perhaps, or the fear of looking weak in front of his peers. The tray crashed to the ground, sending glass and champagne flying. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the scene. Ethan felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted, striding towards the woman. "Do you have any idea how much that champagne costs? More than you'll make in a year." The old woman looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Save it." Ethan cut her off. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash, throwing it at her feet. "Here's $100. Consider yourself fired. Now get out of my house before you break anything else." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed almost entertained by the drama. But no one stepped forward to intervene. The woman slowly bent to pick up the money, her hands shaking slightly. As she straightened up, something fell from her pocket, a small, tarnished locket on a delicate chain. Ethan's eyes locked onto the piece of jewelry. Without thinking, he snatched it up. "What's this? Trying to steal from me on your way out?" "Please," the woman said, her voice suddenly urgent. "That's very important to me. It's all I have left of." "All you have left?" Ethan laughed coldly. "Well, now it's mine. Consider it payment for the damages." He pocketed the locket, ignoring the woman's pleading look. "Security," he called out. "Escort this woman off the premises immediately." As two burly guards appeared to lead the woman away, Ethan turned back to his guests with a forced smile. "Now, where were we? Ah, yes. I was telling you about my brilliant strategy for the upcoming merger." But as he tried to resume his story, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. The woman's eyes, filled with a mixture of sorrow and... was that recognition? It haunted him, stirring up emotions he thought he'd long since buried. Little did Ethan know that this encounter would be the catalyst for a journey that would shake the very foundations of his carefully constructed world. The elderly cleaner was far more than she appeared, and the secrets she held would soon turn Ethan's life upside down, forcing him to confront the true cost of his success and the emptiness of his seemingly perfect life. The morning after the party, Ethan woke with a pounding headache and a vague sense of unease. Fragments of the previous night's events swirled in his mind. The shattered champagne flutes, the old woman's pleading eyes, the weight of the locket in his pocket. He reached for his phone, scrolling through a barrage of notifications. Amidst the usual flurry of emails and social media alerts, one message stood out. It was from an unknown number. "The locket holds more than memories. It's time you learned the truth. Meet me at Golden Gate Park, near the Conservatory of Flowers, at noon. Come alone." Ethan's first instinct was to delete the message and forget about it. He had a board meeting in an hour, followed by a photo shoot for the cover of Tech Innovator Monthly. He didn't have time for cryptic messages from strangers. And yet, something nagged at him. The locket. He'd almost forgotten about it in the haze of the party's aftermath. Curiosity got the better of him, and he fished it out of his discarded jacket. In the cold light of day, the locket looked even more worn and unremarkable. But as Ethan turned it over in his hands, he noticed something he'd missed before: a tiny inscription on the back, nearly worn away with age. "To Margaret, with all my love. Forever yours, James." Margaret. The name stirred something in the recesses of Ethan's memory, but he couldn't quite grasp it. Frustrated, he snapped the locket open. Inside was a faded photograph of a young couple. The woman was beautiful, with a warm smile that seemed oddly familiar. The man beside her had Ethan's piercing blue eyes. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He slammed the locket shut, his mind racing. This had to be some kind of trick, a ploy for money or attention. And yet, before he could talk himself out of it, Ethan was calling his assistant. "Jenkins, clear my schedule for the day. Something's come up." An hour later, Ethan found himself pacing near the Conservatory of Flowers, his designer shoes incongruous against the park's natural beauty. He ditched his usual entourage, feeling strangely vulnerable without his usual buffer of staff and security. As the nearby clock tower struck noon, a figure emerged from the shadow of a massive oak tree. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was the old woman from the party, but she looked different now. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she traded her cleaner's uniform for a simple but elegant pantsuit. "Hello, Ethan," she said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions: hope, fear, and something that looked unsettlingly like love. "I'm glad you came." Ethan's carefully cultivated, cool demeanor cracked. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking slightly. "What's going on here?" The woman took a deep breath. "My name is Margaret Reeves, and I'm your grandmother." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Ethan stumbled back, his mind reeling. That's impossible," he stammered. "My grandparents are dead. My parents are dead. I'm an orphan. That's why you were raised by the state until your app made you rich?" Margaret finished gently. "Oh, Ethan, There's so much you don't know. She gestured to a nearby bench. Please sit with me. It's time you learned the truth about your family and yourself. Numbly, Ethan sank onto the bench. Part of him wanted to run, to dismiss this as an elaborate hoax. But the locket weighed heavily in his pocket, and the woman's eyes, so like his own mother's in that faded photograph, held him captive. Margaret began to speak, her voice soft but clear. 16 years ago, your parents, my son James and his wife Amelia, were involved in groundbreaking research. They were brilliant scientists, working on technology that could revolutionize clean energy production. But their work attracted the wrong kind of attention. She paused, her eyes clouding with old pain. There were threats, attempts to steal their research. Your parents knew they were in danger, but they were determined to see their work through. They thought they could protect you, keep you safe. Ethan's head was spinning. This sounded like the plot of a movie, not his life. What are you saying? That my parents were, what, secret agents or something? Margaret shook her head. No, just idealistic scientists who believed they could change the world. But their naivety cost them dearly. One night, when you were just a baby, there was a break-in at their lab. Your parents. Her voice broke. They didn't make it. Ethan felt as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He'd always known his parents were dead, but hearing the circumstances laid bare like this made it feel raw and immediate in a way it never had before. But why didn't you take me in? He asked, hating how small and vulnerable his voice sounded. Why was I left alone? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Oh, Ethan, I tried. But the people after your parents' research were powerful. They made it clear that if I tried to claim you, you'd be in danger. I had to make an impossible choice. Keep you close and risk your life, or let you go and pray you'd be safe. She reached out tentatively, her gnarled hand hovering near Ethan's. I've watched you from afar all these years, protecting you as best I could. When I saw what you'd accomplished with your app, I was so proud. But then I saw how isolated you'd become, how the money and fame had changed you. I knew it was time to risk everything and try to reach you. Ethan's mind was reeling. Part of him wanted to dismiss this as an elaborate con, but deep down, he knew it was true. It explained so much, the strange sense of familiarity he'd felt, the gaps in his childhood memories, the inexplicable loneliness that had plagued him even as he'd achieved unimaginable success. I don't know what to say, he mumbled, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions threatening to break through his carefully constructed walls. Margaret smiled sadly. You don't have to say anything right now. I know this is a lot to take in. But Ethan, there's more you need to know. Your parents' research, it still exists. And there are people who would do anything to get their hands on it. Ethan's head snapped up. What? But that was years ago. Surely it's obsolete by now. Oh no, Margaret said gravely. If anything, it's more valuable now than ever. And now that you've made such a name for yourself in the tech world, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Ethan understood with chilling clarity. His high profile had put him back on the radar of whoever had been after his parents. And in doing so, he might have inadvertently put them both in danger. As if on cue, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up at the curb nearby. Margaret tensed. We need to go. Now. Ethan hesitated, years of distrust warring with the undeniable pull he felt towards this woman who claimed to be his grandmother. In that moment of indecision, two men in dark suits emerged from the SUV, their purposeful stride leaving no doubt as to their intentions. Margaret gripped Ethan's arm. Please trust me. I know I have no right to ask that of you, but right now, I'm all you've got. Ethan looked from Margaret to the approaching men and back again. In a split second, he made his decision. Grabbing Margaret's hand, he pulled her to her feet. Okay, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Let's go. As they hurried away from the approaching threat, disappearing into the winding paths of Golden Gate Park, Ethan realized that everything he thought he knew about his life had just been turned upside down. The journey ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of an adventure that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the true meaning of wealth and success. Ethan's heart raced as he and Margaret weaved through the crowded paths of Golden Gate Park. The sounds of children laughing and tourists chattering faded into white noise as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He risked a glance back, catching a glimpse of the suited men pushing through the crowd, their faces set in grim determination. "This way," Margaret urged, tugging him towards a less traveled path. Despite her age, she moved with surprising agility, her eyes darting around for potential escape routes. As they ducked behind a thick cluster of trees, Ethan's mind whirled with questions. Who are those guys? What do they want? Margaret's face was etched with worry. They're after your parents' research. The same people who... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. A twig snapped nearby, and they both froze. Ethan held his breath, acutely aware of how exposed they were. After a tense moment, Margaret signaled it was safe to move. They emerged from their hiding spot and hurried towards the park's edge. Ethan's designer shoes, ill-suited for this impromptu chase, slipped on the damp grass. As he stumbled, the locket fell from his pocket, landing with a soft thud on the ground. "The locket!" Margaret gasped. "We can't leave it." Ethan hesitated for a split second before darting back to retrieve it. As his fingers closed around the cool metal, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see one of the suited men looming above, a triumphant smirk on his face. "End of the line, kid," the man growled, reaching for Ethan's arm. In that moment, something snapped inside Ethan. All the pent-up confusion, anger, and fear of the past 24 hours coalesced into a surge of defiance. With a speed that surprised even himself, he lashed out, his fist connecting solidly with the man's jaw. The suited man stumbled back, more shocked than hurt. Ethan scrambled to his feet, the locket clutched tightly in his hand, and ran back to Margaret. "This way," she called, leading him towards a nearby street where taxis were lined up waiting for fares. They dove into the first available cab, Margaret barking out an address Ethan didn't recognize. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Ethan caught a glimpse of their pursuers emerging from the park, frustrated scowls on their faces. As the city blurred past the windows, Ethan slumped back in his seat, his heart still pounding. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He'd assaulted someone. He was running from mysterious men in suits. He was in a cab with a woman who claimed to be his long-lost grandmother, fleeing to who knows where. "What have I gotten myself into?" he muttered, more to himself than to Margaret. Margaret's weathered hand found his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know this is overwhelming, Ethan, but I promise you, everything I've told you is the truth. And right now, we need to focus on staying safe." Ethan nodded numbly, his mind still reeling. He looked down at the locket in his hand, turning it over absently. As he did, he noticed something he'd missed before: a tiny seam along the edge, almost invisible to the naked eye. Curious, he pried at it with his thumbnail. To his surprise, the back of the locket popped open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, metallic object no bigger than a micro-SD card. "What's this?" he asked, holding it up for Margaret to see. Her eyes widened in recognition. "It's the key," she breathed. "The key to everything your parents worked for." As the taxi wound its way through the bustling streets of San Francisco, Ethan realized that his life had irrevocably changed. The world of tech innovations and Silicon Valley parties seemed a lifetime away. Now, he was embroiled in a mystery that spanned decades, with dangers lurking around every corner. But as he looked at Margaret, seeing the mixture of determination and love in her eyes, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging, of family. "Okay," he said, straightening up in his seat. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." As Margaret began to speak, filling in the gaps of Ethan's fractured past, the taxi carried them deeper into the city, towards an uncertain future full of peril and possibility. The taxi wound its way through San Francisco's hilly streets, eventually coming to a stop in front of a modest Victorian house in the Sunset District. The peeling paint and overgrown garden stood in stark contrast to Ethan's sleek mansion in the hills. "This is where you live?" Ethan asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice as they hurried up the creaky steps. Margaret's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Did you expect a penthouse suite? I'm afraid my cleaning lady salary doesn't quite stretch that far." As she unlocked the door, Ethan felt a pang of shame, remembering how he'd treated her at the party. "About last night," he began awkwardly. "I'm sorry for. We'll have time for that later." Margaret cut him off gently. "Right now, we need to focus on keeping you safe." Inside, the house was small but cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and walls lined with bookshelves. Ethan's eyes were drawn to a collection of framed photos on the mantelpiece. He recognized his parents from the locket photo, but there were others, a young boy with a gap-toothed grin who must have been his father, and more recent ones of Ethan himself, clearly taken from a distance. "You really have been watching over me all this time," he murmured, a lump forming in his throat. Margaret nodded, her eyes misting over. "Every day. It broke my heart to stay away, but I thought I was protecting you." Ethan turned to her, 1,000 questions bubbling up. But before he could speak, a sharp knock at the door made them both jump. "Mrs. Reeves?" a muffled voice called. "It's Detective Ramirez. We need to talk." Margaret's face paled. "Quick," she whispered, ushering Ethan towards a narrow door. "Down to the basement. There's a hidden room behind the old boiler. Don't come out until I get you, no matter what you hear." "But," Ethan protested. "Trust me," Margaret insisted, her eyes pleading. Reluctantly, Ethan descended the creaky stairs as Margaret went to answer the door. In the dimly lit basement, he found the hidden door Margaret had mentioned, slipping inside just as he heard footsteps above. The secret room was tiny, barely bigger than a closet. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with old books and papers. A small desk sat in one corner, its surface covered with what looked like complex diagrams and equations. Ethan's eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at. This must be his parents' research, the very thing those men were after. He reached for one of the papers, his curiosity overwhelming his caution. As he did, his elbow knocked against something on the shelf. A small device clattered to the floor, its screen flickering to life. It looked like some kind of prototype, cobbled together from various electronic components. Suddenly, a holographic display sprang up from the device, filling the tiny room with ethereal blue light. Ethan gasped as he recognized the equation hovering before him. It was the same one that had been the foundation of his groundbreaking app. But this version was different, more complex. As Ethan studied it, his mind racing, he began to see how the additional variables could be applied not just to data processing, but to energy production on a massive scale. "Oh my God," he breathed. "This is it. This is what they were working on." The implications were staggering. If this technology worked, it could revolutionize clean energy production, potentially solving the world's energy crisis overnight. No wonder people were willing to kill for it. Ethan's revelations were cut short by the sound of raised voices upstairs. He strained to listen, catching snatches of conversation. "Know you're hiding something, Mrs. Reeves. Have no idea what you're talking about. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ethan's heart raced. He wanted to rush upstairs to protect Margaret, but her words echoed in his mind. "Trust me," she had said. "Stay hidden no matter what." Clenching his fists in frustration, Ethan turned back to the holographic display. If he couldn't help Margaret directly, maybe he could figure out what made this research so valuable and so dangerous. As he delved deeper into the equations, losing himself in the elegant dance of numbers and symbols, Ethan felt a strange sense of connection to his parents. This was their legacy, the work they had given their lives for. And now it was up to him to see it through. Hours seemed to pass as Ethan worked, scribbling notes and making connections. He was so engrossed that he almost missed the sound of the basement door opening. "Ethan," Margaret's voice called softly. "It's safe to come out now." Ethan emerged from the hidden room, blinking in the relative brightness of the basement. Margaret stood at the foot of the stairs, looking tired but relieved. "What happened?" Ethan asked urgently. "Who was that detective? Did they?" Margaret held up a hand to stop his flood of questions. "It's all right. Detective Ramirez is an old friend. One of the few people who knows the truth about what happened to your parents. He came to warn us that the people after the research are closing in. We don't have much time." Ethan's mind raced. "I think I figured out part of what my parents were working on," he said, leading Margaret back to the hidden room. "It's incredible. If we can complete it." "No, Ethan." Margaret cut him off, her voice firm. "It's too dangerous. Your parents' work was never meant to see the light of day. That's why we have to destroy it." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Destroy it? But this could change the world. We can't just." "We have to," Margaret insisted. "Your parents understood the risks. In the wrong hands, this technology could be weaponized, causing untold destruction. They would have wanted us to protect the world from that possibility, even if it meant sacrificing their life's work." Ethan felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. Everything he'd learned, everything he'd begun to hope for, seemed to crumble around him. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice small. Margaret's eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "We run," she said simply. "We destroy the research and we disappear. It's the only way to keep you safe." As the gravity of the situation settled over him, Ethan realized that the life he'd known, the fame, the fortune, the carefully constructed image of the teenage tech prodigy, was over. But as he looked at Margaret, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He had family, he had purpose, and as terrifying as the road ahead might be, he knew that with Margaret by his side, he could face whatever came next. "Okay," he said, squaring his shoulders. "Let's do this. Together." As they began the grim task of destroying years of brilliant research, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change him forever. The spoiled, selfish boy who had humiliated a cleaning lady at a party seemed like a distant memory. In his place stood a young man ready to face the challenges ahead, guided by the grandmother he never knew he had. Little did Ethan know that the greatest tests and the most profound revelations were yet to come. The acrid smell of burning paper filled the small basement as Ethan and Margaret methodically destroyed the last remnants of James and Amelia Reeves' life's work. Ethan's heart ached as he fed diagram after diagram into the old fireplace, watching years of brilliant research turn to ash. "Wait," he said suddenly, pulling a folded sheet from the pile. "This one's different." Margaret peered over his shoulder, her brow furrowing. "It's a map," she murmured, tracing the lines with a weathered finger. "But I've never seen this before." The paper was yellowed with age, covered in a complex series of lines and symbols. At the bottom, barely legible, was a hastily scrawled note. "For Ethan, when the time comes, trust in yourself and in the legacy we leave you. Mom and Dad." Ethan's throat tightened. He looked at Margaret, seeing his own confusion mirrored in her eyes. "What does it mean?" Before she could answer, a sharp knock echoed from upstairs. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "Mrs. Reeves?" a gruff voice called. "This is Agent Donovan, FBI. We have some questions about your grandson, Ethan." Margaret's face paled. "The back door," she whispered urgently. "Go now." Ethan hesitated, unwilling to leave her behind. Margaret pressed the map into his hands, along with a small backpack she'd prepared. "I'll hold them off. Find Detective Ramirez. He'll know what to do next." "But..." "No buts," Margaret said firmly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're all that matters now. Go, please." With a final, anguished look at the grandmother he'd only just found, Ethan slipped out the back door and into the gathering dusk. The sound of splintering wood and shouted commands faded behind him as he ran, his mind reeling with the day's events. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, Ethan found himself in a dingy motel on the outskirts of the city. He spread the mysterious map on the bed, studying it intently. The lines seemed to converge on a location in the Sierra Nevada mountains, but without context, it was meaningless. Fishing the locket from his pocket, Ethan examined it closely. The tiny data chip was still nestled in its hidden compartment. On a hunch, he pressed it against various points on the map. Suddenly, holographic symbols sprang to life, hovering above the paper. "Whoa," Ethan breathed, his tech-savvy mind immediately grasping the implications. His parents had created an augmented reality interface years before it became mainstream. As he interacted with the holographic display, a message appeared. "My dear Ethan, if you're seeing this, it means we're no longer with you. We're so sorry we couldn't be there to watch you grow up. Know that everything we did to protect you and to create a better world. Our research was never meant to be a weapon. It was meant to be a gift to humanity, clean, unlimited energy for all. But we realized too late the dangers it posed in the wrong hands. We've hidden the key components of our work in various locations. This map will guide you to them. But be warned, the journey will be perilous. Trust in yourself and in those who truly care for you. We love you more than you can know. Mom and Dad." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he read and reread the message. For years, he'd filled the void left by his parents' absence with material possessions and shallow relationships. Now, faced with their words, he felt the full weight of their loss and the magnitude of the legacy they'd left him. A notification on his phone jolted him back to reality. His face was plastered across every news site, alongside sensational headlines. "Teen tech tycoon missing. Foul play suspected. Ethan Reeves. Prodigy or fraud? Sources claim Reeves tied to industrial espionage." Ethan's stomach churned. His carefully cultivated image was crumbling, his former life slipping away with each passing minute. But as he looked at the map, at the message from his parents, he realized none of that mattered anymore. He had a mission now, a purpose greater than fame or fortune. And somewhere out there, his grandmother was counting on him. With renewed determination, Ethan began to plan. He couldn't use his credit cards or phone without being traced. He had limited cash, no supplies, and a vague map leading to God knows where in the mountains. But he had something he'd been missing for years, a connection to his past, and a path to a future that actually meant something. As the first light of dawn crept through the grimy motel window, Ethan Reeves, former tech prodigy, now fugitive on a mission, stepped out into a world that no longer recognized him, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The bustling streets of San Francisco felt alien to Ethan as he made his way through the morning crowd. Baseball cap pulled low, hoodie zipped up despite the warmth. He was just another face in the sea of commuters, a far cry from the recognizable tech wunderkind he'd been just days ago. His first stop was a small, out-of-the-way electronics store. The bell jingled as he entered, causing the elderly shopkeeper to peer at him over thick glasses. "Can I help you, young man?" the shopkeeper asked. Ethan hesitated, then pulled out the data chip from the locket. "I need something that can read this," he said quietly. "Something portable off the grid. No internet connection." The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose, but he asked no questions. After some rummaging, he produced an old but serviceable device. "This should do the trick. Cash only, I'm afraid." As Ethan counted out the bills, his last remaining cash, a news report on the small TV behind the counter caught his attention. Still no sign of missing tech mogul Ethan Reeves. In a shocking development, sources close to the investigation suggest Reeves may have been involved in corporate espionage. Meanwhile, tragedy struck in the Sunset District last night as a house fire claimed the life of local resident Margaret Reeves, believed to be Ethan's estranged grandmother. The money slipped from Ethan's numb fingers, scattering across the counter. The shopkeeper looked up in alarm, but Ethan was already bolting for the door, his chest tight with grief and panic. Margaret, gone. The last link to his family, snuffed out just as he'd found her. And now he was being framed, painted as a criminal. Stumbling into a quiet alley, Ethan sank to the ground, his back against the cold brick wall. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss. The grandmother he'd barely known, the parents he'd never truly grieved for, the life he'd taken for granted. As tears streamed down his face, Ethan's hand closed around the locket in his pocket. He pulled it out, running his thumb over the worn metal. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." But as he looked at the locket, at the faded photo of his parents inside, something stirred within him. They hadn't given up, even when faced with impossible odds. They'd fought to protect their research, to protect him. He couldn't give up now. Wiping his eyes, Ethan pulled out the map and the device he'd just purchased. It was time to decipher his parents' clues and figure out his next move. Hours later, Ethan found himself on a Greyhound bus heading east, the city giving way to rolling hills and eventually the looming peaks of the Sierra Nevada. The holographic interface had revealed a series of coordinates, the first of which led to a remote cabin deep in the mountains. As the bus wound its way up into the highlands, Ethan's mind raced. What would he find at the cabin? More importantly, how long before whoever was after him picked up his trail? Night had fallen by the time Ethan stepped off the bus at a tiny mountain town. The air was crisp, pine-scented, a world away from the San Francisco smog. He shouldered his meager backpack and set off down a dirt road, following the blinking dot on his makeshift GPS. An hour's hike brought him to a small clearing. There, nestled among towering pines, stood a weathered cabin. Ethan approached cautiously, years of watching spy movies making him half expect a tripwire or hidden camera. But the cabin appeared deserted, a thick layer of dust covering everything. Ethan's flashlight beam swept across cobwebbed furniture and faded photographs. It looked like no one had been here in years. Just as disappointment began to set in, Ethan's light caught something odd, a section of floorboard that didn't quite match the others. His heart racing, he pried it up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small, metallic cylinder, not much bigger than a soda can. As Ethan lifted it out, he noticed an engraving on the side, "Phase Converter Mark I." "What are you?" Ethan murmured, turning the object over in his hands. Suddenly, a noise outside made him freeze. Flashlight beams swept across the windows, and gruff voices could be heard approaching. "Check the perimeter. The kid has to be here somewhere." Panic surged through Ethan. They'd found him, but how? As the voices drew nearer, Ethan frantically searched for an escape route. The windows were too small, the front door was out of the question. His eyes fell on a narrow trapdoor in the ceiling, the attic. With no time to spare, Ethan shoved the cylinder into his backpack and scrambled up the rickety ladder, pulling it up behind him just as the cabin door burst open. Huddled in the dusty attic, hardly daring to breathe, Ethan listened to the men below tearing the cabin apart. His mind raced. Who were they? How had they tracked him here? And most importantly, how was he going to get out of this? As boots stomped across creaking floorboards below, Ethan clutched the mysterious cylinder to his chest. Whatever this thing was, it was important enough for his parents to hide it away, important enough for these men to chase him across the state. In that moment, as fear and determination warred within him, Ethan made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth behind his parents' work. He would clear his name and honor Margaret's memory. And somehow, someway, he would find a way to use this legacy to make the world a better place, just as his parents had intended. But first, he had to survive the night. As voices below grew more agitated and the search intensified, Ethan Reeves, the boy who once had everything and now had nothing but a backpack and a mystery, prepared himself for the fight of his life. The attic air was thick with dust and tension as Ethan held his breath, listening to the men searching below. His mind raced, trying to piece together how they had found him so quickly. Then it hit him, the electronic device he'd bought to read the data chip. In his haste and grief, he'd forgotten that even older tech could be traced. Rookie mistake, he muttered to himself, silently vowing to be more careful in the future. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through a crack in the attic floor. Ethan froze, hardly daring to breathe as footsteps approached directly beneath him. "Hey, check this out," a gruff voice called. "Looks like there might be an attic up there." Ethan's heart pounded as he heard the scraping of furniture being moved. They were going to find him any second. In desperation, His eyes darted around the cramped space, searching for anything that might help. That's when he saw it. A small window, barely visible behind years of cobwebs and grime. Without a second thought, Ethan scrambled towards it, his fingers scrabbling at the rusted latch. Just as the attic trapdoor began to creak open, Ethan managed to force the window open. He didn't hesitate, launching himself out into the cool night air just as shouts of discovery erupted behind him. The ground rushed up to meet him, knocking the wind from his lungs as he rolled across pine needles and twigs. Gasping for air, Ethan staggered to his feet and plunged into the dense forest surrounding the cabin. Behind him, he could hear angry shouts and the beams of flashlights cutting through the trees. Ethan ran blindly, branches whipping at his face, his only thought to put as much distance between himself and his pursuers as possible. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Ethan's foot caught on a root, sending him tumbling down a steep embankment. He came to a stop at the edge of a swift-moving river, the roar of rushing water filling his ears. As he lay there, trying to catch his breath, a voice called out nearby. "I think I heard something over this way." Panic surged through Ethan. He was cornered. The river was too dangerous to cross in the dark, and his pursuers were closing in. For a moment, he considered surrendering, if only to finally understand what was going on. But as his hand closed around the cylinder in his backpack, Ethan felt a surge of determination. His parents hadn't given up, and neither would he. With no other options, Ethan did the only thing he could think of. He slipped into the frigid river, clinging to a fallen log as the current swept him downstream and away from danger. The icy water numbed his body, but Ethan held on, guided only by moonlight and sheer will. After what seemed like an eternity, he managed to drag himself onto the opposite bank, shivering and exhausted. As he lay there, catching his breath, Ethan's hand brushed against something in his pocket, the locket. Miraculously, it had stayed with him through everything. He clutched it tightly, drawing strength from this last connection to his family. In that moment, soaked to the bone and utterly alone in the wilderness, Ethan made a decision. He was done running. It was time to take control of his own story. With renewed determination, Ethan pulled out the map and the phase converter. As he studied them in the pale moonlight, a plan began to form. He didn't have all the pieces yet, but he knew one thing for certain: the answers he sought lay further up in the mountains. As the first light of dawn broke over the distant peaks, Ethan Reeves set off on a journey that would not only uncover the truth about his parents' work, but also reveal the hero that had been hiding within him all along. 3 days of grueling mountain travel had transformed Ethan. The pampered tech prodigy was gone, replaced by a lean, determined young man with a week's worth of stubble and eyes hardened by adversity. Following the clues left by his parents, Ethan had made his way to a remote research station nestled high in the Sierra Nevada. As he crouched behind a rocky outcrop, observing the facility through a pair of binoculars he'd traded his expensive watch for in a small mountain town, Ethan felt a mix of anticipation and dread. This was it, the culmination of his parents' life work, and the key to unraveling the mystery that had upended his life. As night fell, Ethan made his move. Using the skills he'd honed over the past few days, he stealthily approached the perimeter fence. The security was surprisingly light. Clearly, whoever was running this place relied on its isolation for protection. Once inside, Ethan navigated the dimly lit corridors, his heart pounding with every step. Finally, he found what he was looking for: a large laboratory filled with humming equipment and glowing monitors. At the center of the room stood a machine that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. It was massive, easily the size of a small car, with pulsing lights and arcing electricity. And there, fitting perfectly into a slot on its side, was a space clearly meant for the phase converter cylinder. As Ethan approached the machine, a voice behind him made him freeze. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Ethan." He spun around to find himself face to face with a man he recognized from news reports: Dr. Alexander Vaughn, one of the world's leading energy researchers and, apparently, the mastermind behind everything that had happened. "You?" Ethan breathed, his mind racing. "You're the one who's been after my parents' research. The one who..." The one who had your parents killed? Vaughn finished, his voice cold. Yes, their stubbornness left me no choice. Just as your grandmother's refusal to cooperate sealed her fate. Rage boiled up inside Ethan, but he forced himself to remain calm. Why? He demanded. What's so important about this technology that you'd kill for it? Vaughn's eyes gleamed with a fanatical light. Your parents were naive, Ethan. They thought their discovery could save the world, but they couldn't see its true potential. This machine doesn't just generate clean energy, it can control it. Imagine having the power to shut down entire cities with the flip of a switch, to hold the world's energy supply in the palm of your hand. As Vaughn spoke, Ethan's hand had been slowly moving towards his backpack. In one swift motion, he pulled out the phase converter cylinder. You mean this? He said, holding it up. Vaughn's eyes widened. How did you? Never mind. Hand it over, boy. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. Everything he'd been through, everything his family had sacrificed, had led to this moment. He looked at the machine, then at the cylinder in his hand, and suddenly he understood. His parents hadn't hidden the components of their research to keep them safe. They'd hidden them to prevent the technology from ever being completed. The map, the clues, it had all been a way to lead him here to this moment of choice. With a silent apology to his parents, Ethan made his decision. In one fluid motion, he turned and slammed the phase converter into its slot on the machine. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Alarms blared as energy surged through the device. Vaughn screamed in rage, lunging for the controls, but it was too late. Ethan grabbed the locket from around his neck and smashed it against the machine, releasing the data chip inside. As soon as it made contact with the overloading systems, a blinding light filled the room. When it faded, Ethan found himself standing in a quiet lab. The machine was a smoking ruin, the phase converter and data chip utterly destroyed. And Vaughn was gone, as if he'd never been there at all. As Ethan stared at the destruction around him, trying to process what had happened, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see a familiar face, Detective Ramirez, the man his grandmother had told him to trust. You did it, kid, Ramirez said, a mixture of pride and sadness in his voice. You finished what your parents started. The technology is gone, and with it, the danger it posed. As Ramirez explained how they'd been tracking Vaughn for years, how they'd always been one step behind until Ethan's journey had led them here, Ethan felt a profound sense of closure washing over him. In the days that followed, the truth came out. Ethan's name was cleared, the real story of his parents' work and sacrifice made public. The tech world buzzed with the tale of the prodigy who'd given up his fortune to save the world from a threat it never knew existed. But for Ethan, the greatest reward came in the form of a box of his parents' personal effects, saved from the fire by a Forsyte Margaret. As he sifted through photos, letters, and mementos, Ethan felt closer to his family than ever before. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to him, written by his mother years ago. My dearest Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you've faced challenges we hoped you'd never have to. Know that we are so proud of you, not for what you've achieved, but for who you are. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or fame, but in the lives you touch and the good you do for the world. Never forget that you carry our love with you always. All our love, Mom and Dad. As Ethan folded the letter, tears streaming down his face, he realized that his journey had given him something far more valuable than any technology or fortune. It had given him his family, and a true understanding of his place in the world. Ethan Reeves, once a self-absorbed tech tycoon, now stood as a young man ready to make a real difference. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly rich in purpose, in love, and in the legacy his family had left him. As he stepped out into the bright California sunshine, Ethan knew that his greatest adventures and his opportunity to truly change the world for the better were just beginning. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.